Survival is defined by Merriam-Webster as the state or fact of continuing to exist in spite of difficult conditions. Survival is a human necessity, and in a lot of ways, it begins to shape the way that we choose to navigate the world. For our ancestors, survival looked like coming to a new world, maybe escaping a dangerous regime or restricting government, in order to provide a positive future for their families. For others, it looked like being forced into that new world, stripped of their previous way of life, and being forced to create something out of nothing. We can find the various tactics used by our ancestors for survival in the way that we live today, whether or not the conditions they created them in exist for us today or not. For example, a strong work ethic could be traced back to the ones who came before us and had to build with their hands what we tend to have easy access to. Or the way that we spend money, for instance, could be traced back to that great-great-grandfather who had to provide for a family of 10. The tactics that we use every day for survival are designed to defend our culture, our values, our personal rights, our traditions, or our ideals. But there's a very strange thing about survival. If survival is defined as the state or fact of continuing to exist in spite of, then in spite of insinuates some sort of opposition, some sort of opposing force that we have to defend ourselves from. What happens then when what we use to defend our culture, our values, our traditions, or our ideals begins to center in on the differences of those that we were designed to coexist with rather than defend ourselves from? I want to tell you a story about a time that survival changed for me and my family. It was the summer of 2014. It was very shortly after the shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Brown by a police officer. My parents were preparing my younger brother here, an avid runner and incoming college freshman, for his first semester at school. So my mom sat him down and gave him a very strong list of suggestions that he was to take with him to his first semester, like I'm sure many other mothers have done. And so she sat him down, and she looked him in the eye, and she said, "I want you to remember that your educational success is your first priority. So that means not too much partying or none at all. She said, cultivate good study habits. Choose your friends wisely, and boy, you better manage that meal plan." But then the conversation took a very interesting turn as she added, "And I know you're a runner, I know that you love running, but please just don't run with a hoodie on. Be very careful around police, be respectful, but just try to steer clear of them. If you have to walk around during the day or at night, just make sure that you're walking with someone. And God forbid you get pulled over by an officer. Just keep your hands on the steering wheel and don't you think about touching your wallet." Those are things a mother should never have to tell her son when preparing him to go to school. I remember that moment like it was yesterday, sitting at the kitchen table with my mother and my brother, over listening to their conversation, and remembering how starkly different it was from the conversation that my mom and dad had with us just 4 years prior. But this was our reality. I was watching my mother look into the eyes of her only son, and all of a sudden, she wasn't just preparing him for the best 4 years of his life, as we like to label college, or even to go out in the world and be an upstanding citizen. I'm sure those were hopes that she did have for my brother, but in this particular instance, they seemed so trivial as they took a back seat to what I'm sure was her ultimate hope, that her son would survive. I think the most disheartening thing about what wasn't quite a new reality for us as a Black family, but definitely becoming a more prevalent one, was the lack of empathy. The lack of empathy for what was a traumatic reality, not just for my family, but for African American and minority families across the country. You never quite get used to hearing name after name after name after name of young woman or young man that looks just like you, being killed for reasons that have yet to be proven constitutional, yet with no consequence. Or the times that me and my brother would go to class after hearing about yet another death, and it feels like that person was a close family member, but because you're the minority in your society, everyone kind of goes on as normal. Not a professor, not a friend acknowledges the pain that you feel in that moment. I'd lose count if I had to tell you how many times I heard suggestions or excuses for what a victim could have done or should have done to stay alive. Yet I have too many fingers to list for you how many of those suggested survival tactics have actually worked so far. So me, being a young African-American, young adult, I realized that I'm only one person. But I felt the strongest urge that I had to do something. I'd spent the majority of my undergraduate design career trying to solve the questions that I had surrounding being an African American in America. Questions about our visibility, education, or the way that we were portrayed in the media and the news outlets. All on a quest to find what I realized was simply understanding. Empathy is defined as the ability to share in the feelings of someone else. And so, as I approached my final year of school and my senior capstone, I just had one question to answer, and that was, how do you cultivate empathy between differing cultures? For research, I looked to the history of the Jewish Holocaust. As one who had grown up drawn to study the stories of the survivors of that horrible time, I was really interested in seeing what new perspectives I would gather this time around. However, I don't think I was prepared for the emotional difference that I experienced this time. You see, as I was surrounded by the stories of the horrors that they faced, I realized that there was something starkly different about what I had experienced about my people. You see, in Jewish culture, these stories are kept alive in order that they're not repeated. And I couldn't help but see the differences in how the centuries-old atrocities that my people had faced were looked at. Every quote and every story that was telling us to never forget only reminded me of how many times over the course of my life I was told to forget. And so here I faced another problem. I was looking at two beautiful groups of people who had faced atrocities that are really unthinkable. And I had to discover what the difference was in the way that they were viewed. And so there are a lot of different things that you could consider. You could consider the different systems that our country was built on. But I wanted to do something that really made sense for the context that I was in. And so I came to the hypothesis that the atrocities of the Jewish Holocaust were looked at as atrocities to humankind, which meant this, that there was quite a possibility that if we took the time to look at one another and find what made us human, what connected us together, it could be much easier for us to empathize with one another. If I'm different from you, but I can see us both as being a human being, then all of a sudden we enter the same playing field. So then I had another question to answer. What is one thing that exists in all spheres of humanity that can connect us together? Well, I went back to my mother and the day that she prepared my brother for school, because at the cornerstone of every sphere of society exist mothers. They're the people who give us life. They move mountains. They can literally do anything. You know your mother can get you to do anything. And so, then Mothers with Sons was born. This was my capstone event that would gather mothers all from different backgrounds with the one commonality. They all had sons between the ages of 15 and 25. I chose this particular demographic because from a minority perspective, this is the demographic that is most targeted, especially when it comes to instances of police brutality. And so I gathered these mothers around the dinner table, but before then I had to do a lot of research. And in my research, I talked to mothers from all different backgrounds: white mothers, Black mothers, Hispanic mothers. But my most favorite conversation had to have been with a former professor, Professor Jamie Mahoney. Jamie, a mother herself, had the privilege of creating advertising and marketing campaigns for Mothers Against Drunk Driving, so she knew of the kind of force that I was trying to pull on. But I think out of all of the information that I gained from Jamie, my most favorite thing that she told me was about the experience when she first had her child. And so Jamie looked at me with tears in her eyes, and she said, "Lauren, the most amazing thing happened to me when I became a mother. Something that I really can't describe, but I'm going to try my best to put it into words." She said, "When I became a mother, it was like I wasn't just the mother of my child, but it was like I became the mother of all children." And this was a truth that I hoped would reign true in the mothers that I gathered for this particular event. And so I gathered about 6 to 8 mothers around a dinner table, a very intimate setting. I wanted it to feel like a safe space, a space for them to bond, to grow, and to connect. And in this space, they answered questions like, what was the moment like when you first had your son? What is your favorite memory of your son? What was a moment when you were most proud of your son? What was a moment when you were most afraid for your son? What is your biggest fear for your son? And if any of these women were to see your son walking across the street, what is the first thing you would want them to know about him? And so I want to share with you really quickly one of the many feedback that I got from the mothers at this particular dinner.
It's a situation, it's a problem that all of us can relate to, because I feel like being a mother is not being a Black mother, a Hispanic mother, or Asian mother. We are all mothers, and the cares and the things all mothers do is universal. It doesn't have race, ethnicity, nationality. If you're a mother, all mothers pretty much have the same common denominator. So it's something that should concern all of us as mothers. It doesn't matter where you're from or what color your skin. We should look at it as mothers, period. So it's a concern that we should all have, and we should all be sensitive to the concerns of all mothers.
And so for this particular event, we had a couple of different backgrounds present, not as many as I would have hoped, but what I loved so much about this particular event is that we didn't host a pity party. It wasn't a woe is me sob story for the things that came out that maybe weren't so pleasant. But instead, every woman left feeling empowered. They left feeling charged and challenged, believing that if mothers of all backgrounds could get together to stand up for not just their children or children that look like them, but for all in particular, then maybe change could happen. And that was because they were able to acknowledge the validity of the humanity of one another. And it also means that when those mothers left that event, there's a big possibility that they ran into a young man that maybe didn't look like them, but they thought, oh, what about his mother? Or maybe thought about the fact that he was a son. There's a quote by Professor Michael Eric Dyson that he gave after the death of Trayvon Martin. And he said, at the end of the day, recognize that young Black teens are children of God and deserve every protection. Because if the women on that jury have been able to see Trayvon as their child, they may have heard his blood calling from the ground where George Zimmerman laid him to rest. Mothers with Sons is an ongoing project. It's something that I hope continues to grow and gain new life and gather mothers from all backgrounds, not only nationally, but maybe one day internationally. I believe that the power that mothers have to become the village that our society needs is very strong and very possible. But Professor Dyson's quote doesn't just apply to young Black teens. It applies to every human being. What would happen if we took the time to acknowledge the humanity of everyone we came in contact with, not just ones that looked like us, not just ones from the backgrounds that we're used to, but understanding that there is a human thread because we breathe the same air and we coexist in the same society? How positively then could we change not only our pattern of survival, but the survival pattern of someone else? Thank you.